Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to episode 9 of the Wall of Champions, an F1 podcast. And we're just going to fly straight into it now because we've got a little bit to talk about. So tonight's driver lineup is welcome to the mic, Greg.
Hello.
And Luce.
Yes.
And I'm Webby. Thanks for that, Luce, for affirming that you are in fact Luce. And well, we might as well just fly straight into it. And, we've got our first comment on it. Senraku saying, finally caught one of these live. Good stuff, Senraku. Good to have you here, man. We have got a bit of stuff to go over. So we'll roll straight into it in the post-Singapore glow, or burning wreckage if you're Ferrari, I guess. And
Depression?
Abject depression if you're not a Lewis Hamilton / Mercedes fan. And we'll just get started straight with it. And of course, the big news of the weekend actually happened before the cars even hit the track in Singapore, and that was all the dominoes falling in place for McLaren to give up their Honda power units for next year. They will instead go to Toro Rosso, and McLaren will switch power supply by going to Renault. And Carlos Sainz shaken loose from the Red Bull Young Driver program to make his move to Renault. Don't want to say I called it, but totally called it that one of those drivers were going to end up free. And that's that. So what did you think of all that, Greg? Keeping an eye on who are the winners, who are the losers, and is it good for the sport that this has happened?
I think that all remains to be seen. In a previous podcast, I think I said it was a very difficult decision either way, if you were McLaren at least. I guess if you call anyone winners, it could be Red Bull, because they kind of have Toro Rosso in the pound seat with that engine deal, and if it works out, they can jump in and steal the Hondas, and if it doesn't work out, then they can keep going with their Renault deal, assuming Renault don't flick them, which they shouldn't. And I guess it works out for Carlos Sainz as well, because he can go to a manufacturer now, and if Red Bull want him, they'll take him back to put him in the big team, the big boys team. And if they don't, then Renault are probably on an upward trend, so it should work out for him either way. But whether it works out for McLaren, I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yep. All right. I'll throw the same question to you, Luce. Adding that Senraku's just pointed out something very significant that was said. There was that Renault said that they would not be supplying Red Bull after 2018. Renault making... I'm not sure whether that was actually an official announcement or not, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I don't know about that. But there's rumours.
It was definitely said in the paddock that that Renault would be looking to not supply Red Bull in 2018. And Luce, obviously the obvious loser, was Jolly and Palmer is the loser. But is the sport the winner from this?
Yes.
Or has
yes, because there's no Palmer on the grid. I'll just start straight up. Look, you don't like seeing guys out of a job, but at the top echelon of sport, you want to see the best athletes, engineers, coaches, whatever. You want to see the best. He clearly was not the best. So he's out of a seat. We've got Carlos Sainz has now been afforded, a chance in another team. Obviously, I don't think he would have got a shot at Red Bull the way it's going at the moment. And we've got an interesting situation with Toro Rosso and Red Bull now with the engines. And then on to McLaren. I reckon I don't know what they're doing. Because they've now got to find a lot of money to cover, the money that Honda was giving them. So they will have to find a major sponsor. There's no pussyfooting around. They'll have to find a major sponsor, and they have to hope that Renault do a better job than what they have been doing. Isn't a guarantee, by the way.
What you're saying is that they'll need a new Sheem to stay in the top echelon of the sport.
Yes, a new Sheem.
I'm just gonna pass right over that and not let that trigger me for the deliberate misuse of a word and deliberate mispronunciation. Okay, so with all that in mind, obviously it is big news, and I can't help but feel that Red Bull are the winner. Like Red Bull to me used the position that they've got, having Toro Rosso on the grid, to position themselves to have a bet each way on power unit supply. They can take the Honda deal, knowing that they could certainly take those power units off Toro Rosso probably quite easily if it's successful. They could stick with Renault, long-term partner. Although obviously with Renault's got their own team now. It's going to be interesting to see, as the Renault team continues to move up the grid, how that will affect having Red Bull running the same power unit, and then obviously how McLaren's going to fit into that next year. But also the other thing was, well, it's not even a rumor, but it's fact, due to the Martin's grid walk, talking to the CEO of Aston Martin, is that Aston Martin are eyeing an entry as a power unit supplier into the sport in 2021, if the regs can be cheapened up a little bit, which I think,
V8 engines,
which I think for the most part actually means the removal of the MGU-H, if I've read that situation correctly. Obviously, we're all going to sit here and say the more engine manufacturers, the better it is for the sport.
Yep.
And in regards to the Red Bull situation, are they now extremely well placed to position themselves for the next set of rule changes for 2021, considering that they've now got multiple avenues of success? Whereas McLaren are now bogged into a deal with Renault. They've now got the situation where manufacturers are probably not going to be very eager to work with them because of the way they've rolled Honda under the bus. And you know, the only other providers on the grid all running their own teams. McLaren now seem to me to be wedged, banking on someone like a Cosworth or an Ilmore coming into the sport in 2021. How do you read that situation, Greg?
Well, there were some things, weren't there, of McLaren being interested in building their own engine if the costs were significantly reduced. So I wouldn't say that McLaren have rolled Honda under the bus any more than Red Bull have done the same to Renault, which is why it's understandable that Renault probably, the rumours are that have been touted that Renault want to flick them for 2018. I haven't actually heard that one. I thought it was more likely to be 2019, but
yeah, well, it will be 2019. They'll roll them after 2018 when the current contract ends. Although Christian Horner believes they've got a valid contract for 2019. But I think Renault's argument will be, we can't afford to provide all these teams, and hey, you know, we'll take on McLaren. But Luce, asking you that same question and then adding, what sort of rod for their own back do teams like Red Bull and McLaren create for themselves when they are so critical of their power unit provider? And in McLaren's case, actively seeking to terminate that contract. Obviously, Red Bull, it's often forgotten nowadays, but Red Bull were in the same position in 2015, where, you know, they were desperately seeking a suitor, and the relationship between them and Renault was very, very toxic. So Red Bull and McLaren are clearly disadvantaged by the current rule set. There's no doubt about that at all. And obviously they're finding it difficult to thrive in those circumstances. But do they create a problem for themselves when they do this to their engine partners? And has McLaren sacrificed too much to appease Fernando Alonso? I know that's a big question. I'm sorry.
Well, on the Fernando Alonso part, I don't know if they have made this decision to sort of appease him, but it's certainly it feels that way. And then you hear things where they're going to allow him to perhaps do Le Mans next year even. So it sort of sounds that way. And as for the Red Bull and McLaren shooting themselves in the foot, or, you know, being overly critical of engine suppliers, I think that's just how it is when you've got, unlike Williams, so to speak, you've got McLaren and Red Bull, who are, especially Red Bull now, ultra competitive and want to and almost need to be at the front, competing at the front, but they can't do it. They simply can't do it because they've got engines that just aren't competitive, and so they're frustrated. And I think a lot of people, they're overcritical. I think a lot of people are overcritical at McLaren and Red Bull for them being critical at the engine suppliers. If you sort of if that makes any sense. It's just that these teams, they want to be competitive. They're frustrated that, they've been lumped with these engines that, I think Renault was one of the engines manufacturers saying, yeah, we're going to build a good engine with these new rule sets, and they just haven't.
Renault actually threatened to leave the sport if they didn't get these engine regulations.
Yeah, so there you go. They demanded these changes, and then they've just flat out laid an egg. So
I want to. Yeah.
It's quite understandable that Red Bull are frustrated, and then you look at the performance of McLaren the past couple of years with the Honda engines, and you can see why they're frustrated. And I reckon it's justified.
All right, I want to give last word to you on this one, Greg, before we move on to the actual what happened in Singapore, because I haven't given you much to chew on. Luce has got the two big questions, so all of the things I previously mentioned to Luce, and then also adding, we had our big discussion a couple of weeks ago during a summer break about whether these engine regulations or power unit regulations had been good to the sport. I think we all universally agreed that they really hadn't. And the fact that they'd drawn Honda in is probably a surprise to all of us. Honda's failure to adapt to them very quickly is probably not a surprise to all of us. But looking at the situation we have now with the Renault, with Honda, with McLaren and Red Bull, surely to the rule makers, it's completely obvious that going into 2021, it's abundantly clear that they need to do away with the MGUH as a component of the power unit, or at least standardize it, because obviously it's the money sink for the power unit manufacturers. Do you think that the adding of engine manufacturers, preferably standalone ones rather than actual car makers who have big boards to satisfy, in 2021 is critical to the future of the sport? Because surely we're heading towards a wedge period, aren't we? The way things are looking at the moment, where manufacturers are going to dictate who's actually competitive on the grid.
Oh yeah, well we did talk about it in the summer break. I think it's extremely important. It's more important for the future of the sport than anything, because the Formula E thing, lots of manufacturers are heading in that direction. So if Formula One's to survive, then it needs manufacturers of power units that aren't really like Formula One is their business. You don't want them to be purely road car manufacturers that are only interested in what they can market for, the green segment. So. I don't really know too much about the technical side of the engines, but a lot of that, if they don't do away with the energy recovery stuff, then yeah, they'd have to standardize it. They need to reduce the cost somehow. But big car manufacturers always find ways to spend heaps of money, and I think it wasn't just the MGUH that a lot of this development money is going into. It's also a lot of that lean burn technology and whatnot that gets the engine efficiency and therefore power. So they'll always spend way too much money developing these engines. The only way you could possibly manage the costs, I think, would be some kind of budget cap, but I don't think that'll ever fly.
Surely sooner or later, we the powers that be have to just accept that in order for teams to be competitive in Formula One, they can't avoid spending money. I would have thought it was obvious,
Yeah, well, they tried the resource restriction agreement, which was nice in theory, but no one ever actually obeyed it, and then they completely went against the whole point of cost savings bringing in these engines. So I don't know what the FIA's deal is. They're never consistent with these things, whether they want new regs or cost saving, because new regs never equals cost savings. I don't care what the regs are.
And we pass any judgment onto the Liberty Media new setup at this stage, or is it still too early for those guys to bear any brunt of this? Because I personally, before you answer that, I personally think that Liberty have been very, very positive for the sport thus far.
Oh yeah, absolutely. They can't do anything at this point. They're still bound by their FIA, and the team still control the technical regulations. Like, I'm still skeptical that Ross Brawn will even be able to do anything to influence the technical regulations. So Liberty are in an awkward position where they've got just as much at stake as the teams and the FIA. Arguably, I don't know if the FIA have that much at stake.
Do you think that Liberty have been a value add to Formula One thus far?
Absolutely. Oh yeah, absolutely. It's going great.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, they've been obviously they've opened things up in terms of being able to show Formula One, and their social media's been a lot better, and they seem to be pushing the sport in a more positive direction. But obviously they've not been around long enough to really be an influence on where to push the technical regulations just yet.
Yeah, okay. I'll finish with a hot take by saying all Liberty need to do now is remove Charlie Whiting and the sport will be great. All right. So
And go to an online delivery model.
yes,
Please.
they need to go and talk to IndyCar about people about broadcasting their races online. But obviously, the money they earn from their TV deals is extraordinary. So it's
Yeah, I don't know what they're
crazy.
going to do about it, but I'll pay to watch it online. So please do that.
Me too. All right, so we'll move on to the race. And hang on, Sunrockers added, I'm so surprised Charlie let them race with the rain.
No, I'm not surprised.
No, I'm not surprised. I think Charlie's shown, even at Monza, he wanted to let them qualify in the rain, but it was predictable that somebody was going to crash and there's going to be a red flag and it was going to be stopped for 20 minutes. So... Or an hour.
It was stopped for longer than that. It was stopped for more than an hour, I think, as well. It was pretty late. It was pretty dumb, the whole thing.
It was very dumb.
It should have been restarted earlier than what it was, but...
Yeah, it was. That was just Grosjean not being very good at anything.
Well, I mean, Hamilton had the same moment as Grosjean at Monza, and he held
it.
it.
But then, the difference was that he didn't keep his foot in it, like a muppet.
Yeah, so... I wish they would let them race in the rain more. I think we saw at Singapore they can race in the rain. I mean, what happened at Turn 1 had nothing to do with the rain, except the fact that it randomized the start a bit. But what actually happened had nothing to do with the rain. And after that, it was clean. Like it was very clean. At the worst track of the year, under the lights, it was perfectly fine. Mainly because there was no standing water. But at the same time, it's. These guys are they're too soft. They don't race. I'm now using one of Luce's lines. They're soft that they don't let the cars actually go out there and race in the rain. And anybody can harp back to say, but what happened to Jules? But what happened to Jules had nothing to do with the rain and everything to do with the crane being in a gravel trap. So and obviously his engine cut not working when he put both pedals to the floor. So anyway, all right, don't want to get lost in the weeds and that. We'll move on to the result at Singapore, and we'll start with qualifying. Guys, Friday, Saturday morning, or actually Saturday early evening in Singapore, it looked like Red Bull were going to smash the field. And then Sebastian Vettel Seb gonna Seb and finds an absolutely miraculous lap and takes pole by nearly 0.4 of a second. What a tremendous lap. Obviously, it all went to custard for him on Sunday, but... for Seb to do that and to out-qualify Kimi by 0.6 of a second, it was he done what he had to do, didn't he? Like we'll start with you on that one, Luce. As to how you saw Sebastian take that last ditch pole position.
Well, we've seen it before. He's you give him a car that's close enough in qualifying, and he'll give you an extra couple tenths. Like he's obviously in his Red Bull days, he did this quite a bit. There was one lap at Melbourne. 2011 it might have been, where he got pole position and he was all over the place, hanging it out everywhere. And I guess his lap was quite similar, even brushing the wall in.
Or twice, I think he brushed the wall.
Yeah, a couple times. Yeah.
And then Kimi full on clattered the wall, but anyway.
Yeah, just Kimi things, I guess. But yeah, look, he's got that in him. He's got that qualifying. He can pull a lap out of the bag.
Yeah, is qualifying his strong point, Greg? Is qualifying Seb's ace in the hole?
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah, absolutely. His racecraft has always been a bit dodgy. He's always been bound to a few brain explosions. So, I mean, my point was going to be that I was surprised with neither what he did in qualifying nor what he did in the race.
It was just a very Seb weekend.
It was a very Seb weekend.
Oh, dear.
So, yeah. That would be my summation on it. But I didn't really watch practice. I knew Red Bull were quick, but I was expecting Seb to deliver. So, in qualifying on Saturday. So,
and to think of them doing, 3 cars got into the 39s.
And that's fast.
That's so fast.
Yeah, it was. And I wouldn't even call it a last gasp pole. He was dominant in his first run in Q3, and then in the second run he was the only one who went quicker. So,
yeah,
he was dominant. I think.
Yeah, and it was a monumental pole by quite some distance. It was terrific.
It was very good. It was a vintage Seb, but the race was also vintage Seb.
And it was it was nice to see Mercedes out of the hunt. I'm not a person who likes to see teams not win, but it was a nice change up. We've only sort of seen it, once a year for the last few seasons where Mercedes haven't been there, and it was nice to see a battle between a Red Bull and a Ferrari rather than a Mercedes. I thought there's something a bit different, Luce.
Yeah, it does get a bit dull seeing a silver car on the front row at every every Grand Prix for the past 3-4 years. So it was good to see. Bit of colour out there, bit of red, bit of matte blue and yellow. Hopefully we get to see a bit more of it. To be honest, it'd be a good way to finish the season.
And Greg, speaking of Mercedes, almost a 7/10 gap between Hamilton and Bottas in qualifying.
Bottas was very ordinary all weekend, it would seem.
And that was consistent. It was 7/10 in Q1, it was 9/10 in Q2, and it was 7/10 again in Q3.
I mean, it's yeah. We spoke about this before, but I guess off the podcast. But Hamilton, I guess, just seems that little bit better at getting the most out of a car that's not quite there. That seems to extend to both fins, to be honest. So it's not unexpected to see Bottas quite a way off, but it is a little bit. They'll be asking questions, won't they? Because Rosberg was always a lot quicker than what Bottas showed.
Although this year it might turn out to be a godsend for Mercedes because Bottas might turn out to be exactly what they needed.
It looks like it, doesn't it?
They won't admit that.
Oh, of course not, because Bottas doesn't want to be the number 2 in the same way that Kimi won't want to admit to being the number 2. But the fact is that when one driver naturally outscores the other or outperforms the other as the season goes on, it's how it works out. I mean, Bottas has certainly been better this year than what Kimi has been at Ferrari. But a few wins, he's performed well under pressure. But at the races where the Mercedes has not been the best car, then he hasn't been able to wrangle as much out of it as Hamilton does, and that's why Hamilton leads the championship.
I think Mercedes have got a little. I think they should be a little worried because the last few rounds, Bottas he hasn't had it. The first half of the season, he surprised me a bit. Obviously, I didn't think it'd be all that competitive. He might have been
flattered a bit by Hamilton's fluctuating form, but Hamilton is on form now. And perhaps he looks a bit anonymous.
And well, he looks anonymous whilst Hamilton looks ominous.
But but this is the Bottas that I sort of was expecting to see at the start of the year when he signs. Oh, here we go. He's going to be 6-7 tenths off Hamilton everywhere. And in the race, like qualifying, okay, Hamilton can pull a lap out of the bag as well. But in the race, Hulkenberg at stages was faster than him, and you cannot be slower than a Renault driving a Mercedes.
Actually, speaking of Hulkenberg, best of the rest again. That guy's a bit special, isn't he?
Yeah, he is absolutely. But as once again, as I said before this show started, he was let down a bit by the team, both reliability wise, but mainly I was annoyed when they didn't pit him under the safety car. So
yeah.
They pitted him late anyway. It was a bit late. Dare I say it? They're not, like I said also before the podcast started, perhaps they're just not used to pitting under the safety car unless they deliberately cause it.
Yeah. Two questions about Renault loose after qualifying is that 9 tenths separated Hulkenberg and Palmer in Q2. Nico made it through, qualified P7. Jolyon once again in his P11. We know he's going to be out of the car at the end of the year, if not at Malaysia. He went on to get a 6th place in the race, and good for him for that. It was earned well enough, but obviously he benefited from his own teammates' retirement, the retirement of the other 3. Obviously, I think Renault are going to benefit greatly from having a driver like Carlos Sainz in the second car, so I want your thoughts on that. And second of all, does Jolyon Palmer deserve a shot at another team? I know he's talking to Williams. I'll take that as your response.
I can only face Palmer at Williams looking at Palmer. Like, surely that would be as a reserve driver or something, because I could not see him being a success in any way at Williams. But as for Sainz, I reckon he'll be a big plus. He's still has his mistakes and can be a bit raw at times, but he's got it all there. He, obviously being Spanish, he gets compared to Fernando Alonso a lot, but you see a lot with his driving, it's there. And if Renault can do what they did, obviously, in the early 2000s, then you never know. History could repeat itself.
All right, Greg, and to you, how do you think Palmer would be better than Massa going around for another year for Williams?
Yeah,
and
well,
and I was also going to say, where do you think that will the Renault driver lineup for next year in terms of competitiveness? Looking at all the other teams, where do you think that would rank them in terms of the competitiveness of their driver lineup?
it'd be a great lineup. It would be much better than what they have now. Which, if the car's half decent, I think that will show how competitive their driver lineup could be. In terms of Palmer, yes, I was going to take the Massa angle with it. I guess it will depend on how well they think Lance Stroll is going to develop, because he's getting there. He's getting there. He is getting there slowly, and Massa's been a bit iffy the last few races. And
just say it properly, Greg. He's been trash.
He's been pretty ordinary.
And in the wet, Stroll's looked consistently better than Massa in the wet.
It
Obviously,
is a strange one, isn't it?
Front row
Yeah.
at Monza, he was on the podium at Azerbaijan. Obviously, Felipe had his problem. We know that. And then also he looked better than Felipe, definitely in a race. So it's really weird.
That's where I think they might consider Palmer for his money if he's not going to be much worse than Massa. I could understand why they would do that. I don't think he deserves another shot, but I could understand where they were coming from if they did such a thing.
And Sonraku's just thrown in a smoky because we also know there's one other driver who has not only been talking to Williams, but has scheduled time in a simulator coming up.
Kubica.
Yeah, some Polish dude called Robert Kubica. Loose.
Never heard of him.
Surely if Kubica's on the table, both Palmer and Massa are waving in the sunset.
Unfortunately, it's not that simple.
I think it's a commercial decision more than a...
Yeah, if it was down to driving talent, Palmer and Massa would not be considered, and Kubica would probably be driving right now.
Right. And then, well, I also want to throw in, because Senraku also mentioned Paul di Resta and how he would fit into that.
No.
He's had his chance a few years ago, and I don't. He's not good enough.
Burned through a lot of front wings, that kid.
Yep.
You can finish off your thought, Luce.
Well, I don't really have another thought. He had obviously had an agenda against his front wings.
All right, and I want to see a meme be made out of Luce saying he hasn't got another thought. All right, so we'll move along. Obviously, it was good for McLaren. It was predicted it was going to be good for McLaren. They were quite comfortably top 10 all weekend. 5th best car, with Alo and Van Dorn 8th and 9th behind Hulkenberg. I think it is fair to say Renault had a better car than McLaren, taking out of account obviously that Alo was P3 when he lost half his car in the side of Max Verstappen. And it was not good qualifying, obviously, for Williams, who really, really struggled again, both out in Q1. They have a much better race car than they do qualifier. So, which is weird, because you would think that a car that's got a Mercedes in the back of it that has special qualifying modes would do better in qualifying, but I think it's just a really poor car.
Poor car. And Singapore, I don't think it matters so much.
And Stroll was only 0.3 faster than Verline in the Sauber, and I think everybody accepts that the Sauber is it's basically a wagon with wooden wheels at this point. Well, not on Luce's F1 2017 game, but everywhere else in real life, it's one of the worst cars we've seen for quite some time, I think. Probably since the Manor that year when they ran year-old Ferrari engines. What was that, 2015?
Wasn't that every year of their existence?
Oh, they had Mercedes engines, remember, at the end?
Oh, yeah, for one season or whatever it was. But I don't think that... Well, I can give Manor a pass for being that bad. I can't give Sauber a pass for being that bad. Or this bad, I should say. Because this is a team that, it's been around a while. They should be designing and hiring people that are capable of designing better cars.
And Force India had a poor qualifying performance as well. So I'll move on to the race, because that's what everyone wants to talk about. We've delayed it for half an hour. Can
we skip the first 5
10
laps,
seconds
please?
of the race?
Rocco
said, not saying Di Resta is a good choice, but you'd rather him rather than Palmer. Well,
I was going to say he's a better choice than Susie Wolf.
Yes.
That's about it.
And we know Williams were lining up to put Adrian Sutil in the car before they let Susie Wolf in it. So.
I was going to say, if they're going to bring anybody back to drive that car and Sutil, I'd say he's at least driven with these kind of engines. Just put him in the car.
Yeah. Well, he can try and take back his record from Nico Hulkenberg that he lost over the weekend.
Yep.
All right, so we'll move on to the race, and what a disaster it was for everybody who wears red. That was trash. It was heartbreak at the start because obviously for championship-wise, we really needed that strong result for Ferrari.
No, how could Max do that to us?
It sounds like Greg was manning the Ferrari Twitter account mid-race. Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, once again, Max Verstappen causing an accident between two Ferraris. Where have we seen this before?
All right. Well, before we continue, I want to make it clear that we are just joking. I don't think any of us here actually think that was in any way, shape, or form Max Verstappen's fault. I think it was the right result that no one was penalised. But Luce and I'll be honest, Luce and I had a lengthy, strong discussion about this before we started recording. I think that while Seb wasn't penalisable for what happened, I think he was a little bit silly in what he did, and I'll give Luce first right of reply.
Well, from my point of view, it's he's done what I know how this is going to go because obviously we've had this argument, but in my view, he's done something.
Not unprecedented. Yeah.
It's not unprecedented. Every driver off the start line moves over, and then from that, for anybody that's driven a racing game and gone in cockpit view, you can't really see much. Your mirrors at that point aren't all that good. Max might have been even in a blind spot of Seb's, and then you've got obviously Kimi Räikkönen made the start of his life, and it just.
Yep. So
it was just, in my eyes, it's just a complete racing incident. It was textbook.
Oh, I don't disagree that it's a racing incident, but I'm glad you've said all of those things, because now I'm going to throw to Greg and say all those things that Luce said are just true. The mirrors don't work. Max could have been in his blind spot. Obviously, Kimi was a driver who made a blinding start. Why would you move to the left like he did then?
Well, first of all, the first thing I'll say is that I read Lewis Hamilton's comments earlier today, and they pretty much match up line for line what our Lewis has just said. So first I want to ask Lewis, is it true then that you completely agree with Lewis Hamilton for a change?
I've not always disagreed with Lewis Hamilton.
Change his tune now. Listen to him. Listen to him.
So I just wanted to get that out of the way first.
Oh, jeez.
But like Lewis said, it's not unprecedented, and it's something that I've seen a lot of drivers do at Singapore quite a bit, which is the old move them over to the left and get them to back off kind of move. And Hamilton did. Even Hamilton in his statement said he did the same thing at Monza to Stroll, and he even said that sometimes you move over not really knowing where they are, and you do it even when you don't have to, and you're still taking a risk, and you don't really see where they are until it's really, really late.
You basically just close your eyes and salute and move the car to the other side of the road, yeah?
Yeah, basically. That's where he was getting at with it. So, and I thought, well, I mean, when I thought to myself, well, Lewis can be very balanced and reasonable in his opinions when things go his way. But I don't think he's wrong. So I agree that it's just one of those things. It's Seb's fault. I was actually inclined to think that Kimi contributed to it a little bit, because I thought he could have given Max a bit more room and he would have had the best view of what was going on. And when I watched the onboard, it seemed like Kimi moved a bit to the right before all the contact happened. But I'm not prepared to say it was Kimi's fault. I have to say it's down to Seb mostly. And it's just an unlucky chaining of events that's happened. So it was the right call not to penalise anyone.
Oh, I definitely agree with that. And for me, it was 100% a racing incident. But I guess from my perspective, my view of it was what Max said. So whilst Luce might agree with Lewis, I agree with Max. And that certainly doesn't happen all the time. But what he said was, if you're he's fighting for the championship, why did he do it? Like it's such a big risk to take, right?
Yeah, I know, and this is the discussion that I heard you two carrying on vigorously before this podcast started.
Well, you didn't even
But
hear it during the race on Sunday night.
No, there was obviously that aspect of it, but
Yeah.
I agree with what Lewis said to an extent, which is that he really doesn't need Max in front of him in Singapore or up the inside. To be quite honest, there's every chance that a Spa type incident would have happened if they went 3 wide into turn 1, because Seb still doesn't know that Kimi is there, similar to the incident at Spa.
Yep.
So I mean, if you're on pole and you you're trying to control the start first of all, so he's I think he's well within his rights to do that, and I think ideally, I know you're in a championship fight, I know Hamilton's behind, but you don't know what kind of start Hamilton's got, and you don't want to be under pressure by not having the track position. Like, you have to. Another important thing to remember is that in a race like what we saw, it would be a massive advantage to be in the lead with no spray. So I can understand why Seb would be keen to try and forcefully maintain the lead, because it's been done before, and it's pretty much every time it's been all right. Nothing bad has happened. But Kimi decided this one occasion that he'd get a good start for a change, and it wrecked everything. So it's all Kimi's fault.
Yeah, he wouldn't do it at Monza 2015 when he's
Off
on the
the
front row.
No, that would be useful.
That was where he went from the front row to last by turn 1. That was quite
Yeah,
an
and
effort.
I called it. You watch as he's last by turn 1.
Yeah, it happened. It happened, mate. It was terrific.
last when he wasn't even over the start finish line yet.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I mean, as I said, I'm not going to argue that it was just purely a racing incident. That no one bears the brunt of the fault, and the right decision was made without a penalty. All 3 drivers copped their penalty by being out of the race. Max was completely without fault. Kimi could have gone more to the left, but obviously it was wet. So these things, it's very difficult to say that to a driver when the track is as wet as what it was, and we know that the further you get off the line, the worse it gets. It's just for me that if I was in Seb's position, I would have held it straight, because I think the fact that the start was wet, experience tells you that the starts are going to be variable. And Seb knew he got a bad start. Like, both he and Max both got bad starts. Kimi got a blinder. Hamilton got a good start. Alonso got a blinder. That's what happens in the wet. You have to think that somebody's going to be putting a move, and the best thing for you to do is hold the straight line to make sure you don't turn in on somebody and end your race at turn 1. I definitely agree. I definitely understand and agree with everything you guys are saying, which is, for him, ideally, he wants to be P1 out of turn 1, and he'll defend that position. But at the same time, he moved over quite aggressively, and it's not the first time he's done it. It is a habit of his, and I'm sure he learned it from Michael, because Michael used to do that as well. And this time it's bitten him, and it could cost him this championship. And so I guess what my point was is that he didn't have to be that aggressive. And hindsight's 20/20. It's an easy thing to say, but he didn't have to be that aggressive, and he didn't have to lead the race to take back the lead of the championship out of turn 2. So, in the
He
end,
didn't.
no, in the end, he chopped up a driver in the wet, at a tricky first corner, and I just felt like he took a risk that he didn't need to take. And that was my point of it. I mean, as I said, I don't want him to get penalised. I don't think he should be held accountable or blamed for what happened. But just from his own personal perspective, and I think he feels the same way, because he did apologise after it happened, is that he was too aggressive. He was super aggressive when he really didn't need to be. That was my position, and in tricky conditions. Obviously it cost him. Like, it cost him big time, and it cost Max, and it cost Kimi. So, yeah. Anyway, I don't want to get bogged down on it, because I know there is a little bit of difference of opinion with it, but I think that we're all satisfied that no penalty out of it. But I did make the comment before we started the podcast that if Seb doesn't win the championship this year, he's lost it himself. He'll only have himself to blame. With Azerbaijan, now with Singapore, he'll only have himself to blame for those points that he's lost. So, but I'll let you have the last word, Liz.
Well, honestly, where am I going to start?
This sounds like it could take a while. I should give Ben breakfast.
We spoke about it before the podcast. It was just a wet start thing. It's just that none of these drivers, I don't think, have ever started in the wet off the grid. I'm trying to think. Maybe 2008 at in England in the British Grand Prix.
Surely there's been a wet start.
Maybe, but I don't think like.
I'm sure we had wet starts last year. Silverstone started wet 1 year, not last year, year before, and it started off.
I thought it was
a stationary start.
I couldn't
maybe,
recall a standing start in the wet. I honestly couldn't recall one, but I'm sure that there has to have been one at some point.
Maybe it was. Maybe there was one last year at Silverstone, but I don't think there's not enough of it. It hasn't happened often enough for drivers to really think, okay, this is what happens at a wet start, and because they've not been afforded to. Every time it's been wet, we've started behind a safety car. So I think that was obviously an unknown. I think that didn't help. And then Greg pointed out what I said before the podcast, in that I think, I don't think Seb wanted to be behind Verstappen, even though like he would have known. Obviously, it's okay to finish second. But I think, you don't want to be behind Max there, and he would have made it difficult to pass him in the race. And we've seen races like this before, especially with Fernando Alonso in slower cars, where he's got in front in these kinds of races in much slower cars, but he's been able to control it. And that's what would have happened had Verstappen taken the lead. So there's that extra bit of urgency to sort of, okay, I don't want him to get in front.
Yeah. I can understand his thinking process. I just wouldn't want to be anywhere near Max, basically.
Yeah, so that, and then obviously we've seen what's happened before with the same three drivers,
I'll also add that there was wet standing starts at Silverstone in 2015 and Coda in 2015. They started in the wet stationary start.
Yep. Hamilton did the old I understood. I'm sorry about that Nico trick.
Yeah.
Yep. Carry on, sorry, Liz. Just to add that.
And then there's also the even if he had a given room, the way Kimi and Max were, like, there's every possibility.
Yeah.
They outbrake each other. Seb's on the outside and has to go off the road. He's lost position to Fernando Alonso, Max Verstappen, Kimi Räikkönen, Hamilton, and probably Bottas as well. And that's through no fault of his own.
Yeah, but that's better than being out at a race with a punctured hole in your radiator.
But you don't know, because he might come back on the track and get clipped by someone else.
No, you don't know. I mean, anything can happen, but it's just when you choose to make that aggressive move for yourself, it's more likely to happen. Like when you choose to be the protagonist in the story, then the bad stuff's going to happen to you. Like that's just how I feel about it. Anyway, as I said, look, I don't want to get bogged down on it because I know we disagree on it, and it'd be very easy to sit here and talk for another 15 minutes about it and end the podcast that way. So I want to move on and say, if Hamilton wins the championship this year, surely this will be the defining race for that championship, Greg?
Well, there's still a long way to go yet. We'll see. If not much changes in terms of reliability or incidents and whatnot, and it's the we go back to our standard form, then I guess it would be a defining race in the championship in terms of how it was won and lost.
I just mean that in terms of the race, where the one race of the year where Mercedes were expected to really struggle, Hamilton maximised his result and got 25-0 over Sebastian. That's a huge turnaround of how people, the form book was looking for the end of the year.
Yeah, there's that. There were other races. I mean, Ferrari delivered in Monaco when Mercedes struggled. So it ebbs and flows. But I guess if he does lose it, which it's looking increasingly likely that he will, but there's still a while to go. Then they'll look back on this result, and it'll be remembered as the race that he lost the championship in. Because I was talking to Valari actually ever so briefly just by email today, and we both agreed that Ferrari do lose it, that we don't think the car will be to blame. Certainly a car worthy of a world championship. So
it is, but I don't think it's just quite fast enough, and I think that's cost him in one or two races this year.
But it's a car capable of winning a championship. And so I don't think you can put you'd certainly. What I'm saying is that from this point, if they lose it, you couldn't put it down to the car like it was so easy to do in other basically every other championship since like 2000 and I don't know 8.
Yeah.
So
Lose the championship's over, isn't it?
Certain. It's done.
Yep, that was a short conversation.
Hashtag cool.
So this will be the
It's
last
all over.
podcast
You
then
can-
for the year. Or?
You can
We'll go
take
into yep.
take it out of the oven. It's cooked. It's done.
We'll go into hiatus until 2018
Yeah,
to start all
we'll
over again.
see you in pre-season testing, lads.
Start talking about next year's cars.
Yep. All right. So Nraku's also said that this race in Baku will hurt Vettel. 2 races where he basically threw away a win. Don't know if you said that about
Don't
Singapore.
know about Baku.
Well, yeah. I mean, Baku obviously Hamilton had his headrest problem, but he was in front of Vettel at the time. So as it turned out, Vettel would have won a race, but he wasn't to know that Hamilton was going to have that headrest failure at the time. And you could also argue that it was the red flag that led to that as well. And there's no guarantee that it was a. Yeah, anyway, I know what you mean, and I do somewhat agree. And both of those races have one thing in common, which is Baku, Seb definitely hurt himself, and Singapore, Seb arguably hurt himself. So, Daniel Ricciardo drove around a broken gearbox for the entire race. Apparently, Red Bull saw it in the very first safety car period that his gearbox looked like it was only going to last a half distance, and he had to drive around it, and he did stupendously to finish only 4.5 seconds off the back of Hamilton. Oh, what might have been for the Red Bull loose?
I think it speaks more about Valtteri Bottas than what it does Daniel Ricciardo.
Oh, stinging criticism.
Look, how Bottas is in a Mercedes and he's finished 4.5 seconds behind him, and didn't look like challenging him. Obviously Ricciardo's done. None of us knew during the race that he'd had a problem. We thought, oh mate, look, Hamilton was just driving a blinder. But I think you look back on it and think he's only finished 4 and a bit behind him, and he was there or thereabouts with Lewis the whole race. So to manage to do that is an incredible effort. Although I would have liked to have seen him hit for dry tyres a bit earlier.
Oh, I know where this conversation's going to end up. And but I'd like to throw it to you now, Greg, and say, if Daniel Ricciardo, if that was any other driver in that situation, if it was Max, if it was Lewis, if it was Seb, if it was Kimi, how much bleeding over the radio would we have heard about that gearbox problem?
Well, I don't want to make a very strong comment on that because it's obviously very selective what we hear from FOM. We probably would have heard a bit of complaining. I don't know. I don't know. It depends. It depends. I don't know if I could comment on something like that.
Damn it, Greg, I'm looking for controversy, damn it.
Well, you don't generally. I don't know if it's by choice or what, but you don't generally hear Ricciardo complain all that often on team radio anyway. I don't know if that's by coincidence or if it's...
He does get fired up.
But compared to other drivers, like...
What I'm saying is that we don't hear everything that is said on the radio of every driver at all times. So we can't... I can't say, like...
But generally when there's a massive... When there's a problem with a car like that, like... Obviously,
Ricciardo generally doesn't have problems like that with the car, so we've got no form on that. Max is the one whose car's been breaking down every time, so
I'm just speaking in general that when FOM pick up, radio transmissions, where there's a problem with the car, generally FOM would play that. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not going to say that FOM are trying to portray a narrative by selectively picking.
Well, maybe Red Bull just, spoke in code about it over the radio, so it wasn't picked up.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised we didn't hear about it, to be honest, because they would have had to have told him at some point that you have a gearbox problem and you need to manage it.
Well, it was said because Ted spoke about it during the race that he'd heard over the radio that Ricciardo had a gearbox problem. So that was where it first came from, and it turned out to be true. It's just
so it's a bit weird that FOM didn't pick up on that and tell us. I mean, it comes back to the FOM want to push the Hamilton's God narrative. You see, it's all a big conspiracy.
I just wanted to
not a conspiracy. It's true.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that Daniel Ricciardo, another string to his bow is the fact that he just gets on with it sometimes. Yeah, he just puts his head down and does what he has to do and maximizes his result.
Yeah, it was Alonso-esque. It's another Alonso-esque quality that we've seen
I'd
from
say
Fernando.
I don't think staying off the radio was particularly an Alonso-esque trait.
I thought you were talking about driving around problems. not
Yes,
staying
sorry,
off the radio.
I was being facetious. We'll do what all the analysts probably should do in this race and skip straight over Valtteri Bottas, who has already been pointed out was quite anonymous, and boom shakalaka, vamos, Carlos Sainz P4. Obviously, he inherited the position with Nico Hulkenberg's retirement, or his
and everyone else.
and everyone else. But Carlos Sainz in a Toro Rosso that probably didn't have much right to be performing as well as what it did, and on the super soft rather than the ultra soft like everybody else. He did a cracking job. P4. That's his best result in Formula One.
Yeah, it's a bit like what Lewis said with Ricardo's drive, underlining what an ordinary job Bottas did. But the only thing I can think of right now is what an ordinary job Kvyat did, in comparison to Carlos Sainz. Yeah, but
Kvyat was stuck behind drivers though.
Yeah, he also got stuck in the wall. So,
he did get stuck in the wall. I'm sorry, guys.
I crashed.
I'm actually interested what they'll end up doing with him, but I guess Toro, he's got a lifeline.
They've re-signed him, haven't they?
Yeah, he'll be there.
Yeah.
He'll be there next year.
He'll have a lifeline now.
He'll be their experienced driver alongside Pierre Gasly next year.
But yeah, Sainz was really good. Can't
Yeah.
say
Pierre
enough about him.
I mean, obviously there was strategy played a part, Loose.
Yeah, it did.
But yeah, strategy played a part. But Carlos Sainz went from P10 to P4. He's off to Renault next year. Jolyon Palmer went from P11 to P6, and he's out of Renault next year. Sure,
Hey, he was up to P2, mate. He was up to P2. He wasn't unlucky today.
but he still got rolled,
Yes.
and he would have got rolled by his teammate if his teammate hadn't have retired.
And he would have been rolled by Stoffel Van Dorn if he had a more powerful car.
Do you have any sympathy for Jolyon Palmer? He obviously did a good job. He got a result here.
Why would I have sympathy for him? He's finished in 6th place. That's his best ever finish, and it will be his best ever finish.
By the way, Liz, only his second ever points finish.
Well, that underlines it, doesn't it? It doesn't
Yeah.
matter that he's got a 6th place. Maldonado's got a win, and he's not in the sport, so...
Yeah.
You know, I don't really feel sorry for him, no. You give someone enough chances, a lottery will give them more points.
Yeah. So, and the other thing is that Sergio Perez finished P5 in a Force India that looked pretty average on Saturday, and he really dragged it forward, maximised his result, and maybe he got his experience. Beat Ocon this weekend, Loose.
Yeah, you could say that. You could say that, but at the same time, I mean, you look at the guys that he's beaten in the points there, and there's not much
Well, he got
quality. Aside from Ocon, obviously, there's not much there in terms of car performance or quality driver that you could say he's really beaten there.
Well, he jumped Van Dorn. Van Dorn did have a slow stop in the middle of the race, but he you know, that Force India wasn't as fast as the McLaren over the entire weekend. And he did jump Van Dorn, and Van Dorn started in the 10. You know, he jumped. He's jumped up pretty well. He's jumped ahead of the Hasses. Oh, actually, no, he's behind the Hasses in qualifying. Actually, if I remember rightly. And Ocon wouldn't have got a point if Magnussen hadn't have DNF'd. So you know, it's a.
Well, he did a solid job. I'm not saying he's done a bad job. He's done a solid job, and probably solid's probably not the right word, but a professional job.
Yeah.
End up where he has.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Who was the standout performer of the race? I think was definitely Fernando Alonso. Yeah, for the whole half a corner that he was actually in a race before he got wiped out.
Look, it might have been the greatest start I've ever seen, but he didn't he didn't make it to turn 2, so I can't put him up there.
You are brutal. Surely, Greg, driver of the day was Alo.
Oh, well, that just happens by default. I think what we decide after that is just who is the next best driver each race.
We just sound like a couple of Alo fanboys here, Greg.
Yes, well, you know.
Yes, about that.
Yes, I might have been accused today of being a rampant Alo fanboy. And we saw that, I guess the other thing we saw was another good performance from Stroll. We already mentioned that he thoroughly outperformed Massa in the race. Luce, you were his harshest critic at the start of the year. Do you think Lance Stroll deserves his place in the grid now?
Just.
Ah,
Just. He has. I'll admit he has improved and he is looking a little bit better, but there needs to come a point either by the end of this season or early next season where he's going to start actually driving the car, because he still looks like he's hanging on for dear life a bit. I think he's got to start just going out there and just trying to wring the neck out of the thing.
Greg, in playing devil's advocate to Luce's position there, surely Stroll's done a good job in not burying the car into the barrier at all these races, like many other drivers much more experienced than him have done.
yeah, he's doing a good job, and I think his place in Formula One is a bit more secure than what Luce suggests it might be. I was also a harsh critic of him.
Mhm.
I think everyone was, but I think you have to give him credit. He's doing much better than we thought he would.
Yep.
He is improving. There is an upward trend.
Yeah, I think.
From where he was, and how old he is, obviously that's what you want. And that's all I'm asking for now is just to continually improve. But
I'll let him know.
still got to find that next gear, and he's got to find it, I reckon, relatively quickly. Because if he doesn't show it soon, he'll be stuck at Williams or out of the sport in a couple of years.
Well, I mean, I think stuck at Williams is a relative thing. I don't think that he showed potential to be a world champion. Like he hasn't fronted up, and he's not Carlos Sainz. He's not the next big thing. But he's a solid set of wheels, and as Senraku's just pointed out, he looks shaky at the wheel, but he hasn't crashed since Bahrain, and the Williams car seems hard to drive. And not only that, he's out driving Massa. And Massa is a guy who's got a lot of experience. He's the complete opposite of Stroll in that regard. And Massa should know how to maximize the result in that car, and yet Stroll is quite consistently, if not matching him, beating him, particularly in the wet. I mean, we all know that Felipe hasn't got a terrific record in the wet, but Stroll to me, if you're performing better than Massa, you deserve your place in the sport. Massa's a guy who almost won a world championship after all.
I'm not sure you can judge Massa on this year. He's been, especially the second half of the year, awful.
Well, why you still have to judge him though? You can't just not judge him. No one gets a free pass. It's not like he actually retired. He didn't retire.
He should have retired. I'll leave it that way. He should have retired. But look, Stroll, he's warranted his place. The last, obviously, second half of the year, he's warranted his place in Formula One.
Can we all concede that we were too harsh on him at the start of the year when we said he's an absolute numpty and he shouldn't be there? I'm happy to concede that.
Sure. Why not?
I'm happy to concede that he's a lot better than I initially gave him credit for, and he's gotten better with the more time he's spent in the car.
For me, judge his first few races, he didn't look like he belonged.
Yep.
Well, but obviously the last few races, he's shown that he warrants a place on the grid.
Oh well, that's a good concession from you, Luce. I'm glad we finally got that one out of you. And yeah, I mean, we spoke briefly about Alo, but I felt that was such a sad result for him. It was the first time he's looked motivated all year. He desperately wanted to stay in a race, even though his car, the left-hand side of his car looked like a deformed transformer, and it was electronics hanging out of it everywhere. You feel for the guy, right? Like he got a good start. He had himself in the top 3 after turn 1, taking into account obviously there's the accident. And he felt, like he was saying from the get-go this weekend, that he felt McLaren could challenge for a podium, and all taken away from him by something completely out of his control. It's sort of like his whole McLaren career.
Cursed.
Yeah, his McLaren stint epitomized in one race, right, Greg?
Yeah, whenever it's looked good, something's come in to destroy it. I don't know what else there is to say, really. It's a massive shame. I really wanted to see where he could have ended up.
Yeah.
Mate, he could have ended up on the podium, for all we know.
He could have done, and might not have even taken his teammate deliberately crashing this time to get him there.
That's right, but it would have come with a degree of irony because seeing as the Honda...
Yeah.
the Honda... Like, can you just imagine... I know it's a long shot, but just imagine that he does somehow get in front of Hamilton like he said he was in front of him, and he actually does manage to hold him off to win the race. I know it comes after summer, but they talked a lot about how McLaren, if McLaren could win, he would stay with them and he would back Honda.
And now they've rolled Honda
massive
under the bus.
It would have been a massive,
Yeah,
massive
just
irony to
days
see them
after
win.
they announced
Just
it.
day after, yeah.
Yeah.
That would have been very funny, but I guess it went the way it kind of has always gone. Depressingly.
Luce, can McLaren Renault next year get on the podium?
Yes.
Wow, I wasn't actually expecting you to answer that way.
They can. Obviously, you got Fernando Alonso in the car, and as we saw, in a couple of the changeable condition races this year, there's been times where Hulkenberg, obviously in this race, wasn't too far off, the podium himself. And if you put someone of Fernando's caliber in the car, you trust McLaren to build a better car than Renault. I reckon we'll see it.
Yep. All right. So we've ticked over an hour. So I think we'll call it. I think we covered the Singapore race well. I think we covered all the.
We haven't covered everything.
What haven't we covered, Luce?
The drivers just not having a crack.
Oh, I was hoping we're going to avoid this. All right, you've got 30 seconds to espouse your point of view. Go on.
All right. Everyone out there, aside from Lewis Hamilton, had nothing to lose in that race.
Except the front wing and a wheel.
And their lives.
They weren't going to die, Greg. They
Maybe.
Jeez. And none of them took a chance to pit, say, lap 22 or 23 to try some dry tyres. None of them. And it took until, obviously, Mr. Suck My Balls himself to show that he's actually got balls to put some dry tyres on and have a crack.
Hey, Luce, where did Magnussen finish in a race?
His car failed, mate.
Didn't finish, did he?
He didn't bin
I
it.
bet that's because he pitted early for dry tyres somehow.
Yeah, he was going too fast and blew his engine. That's right. Going too fast.
He gained 3 seconds.
And that
pitting
3
early.
seconds, if Ricardo was close enough, he could have, leapfrogged Hamilton.
Or he could have buried at 3 wheels.
Perez could have finished in front of Sainz. Palmer could have finished in front of Perez.
They could have
Van
all.
Dorn
They
could have jumped Palmer.
And they all could have ended up 3 wheels deep in the barrier. Greg, what did you feel about the time they actually crossed over onto the slicks? Was it right, or could they have gone earlier?
Maybe they could have, but it's extremely high risk, and like you say, I don't think the reward was big enough to justify it. Certainly for where the more strung out runners at the front. So I didn't think that they had. I didn't think it was as bad as Lewis suggested. I mean, we talked about it before the podcast. Another one of these things where it's nighttime. There's no sunlight. It's very humid, so the track wouldn't have been drying up.
A lot of
much.
white lines because it's a street track.
A lot of white lines, and not only that, it's very low speed, so you don't have as much downforce. And when you've got lots of high-speed corners, I think the cars pick up a lot more water than they would if they're just sort of rolling through the corner. So, I think it's got these sorts of races. You get good results by not binning it. So, discretion is better part of valor. So I think,
and I think another important factor to it is that at this kind of race where 2 Ferraris and a Red Bull and a McLaren are all out at turn 1, there's big points up for grabs for these midfield teams. And I think that for the most part, there's a number of them who wouldn't want to take the risk. Like, why would Toro Rosso do it with Sainz, kind of thing? Like, it's if you've got points on the table and you're in a close battle for 5th, 6th in the championship, you don't risk that on 0 points to do that. Maybe in the old days, I'll finish off. But maybe in the old days when it was Jean, and it was only points for the first 6 finishes. Yeah, you take a chance. But these guys need the points. And the day when, like I said, 2 Ferraris out, a Red Bull out, a McLaren out that looked like it was a points contender, that's 4 spots that a Haas, a Williams, a Toro Rosso can go in there and get some ground back in the championship. They can't afford to take the risk. They need the points. Maybe Force India could. But,
maybe Sauber.
This is the argument that I was pushing forward. It wasn't so much some of those teams, but it was more aimed at, say, Red Bull, who aren't going to finish at any lower or higher. And a team like Force India, where these guys aren't really going to lose where they are in the Constructors' Championship, and they could get some, a really good result or a win or a podium where they wouldn't have.
But you say Red Bull, but Ricciardo's still fighting for the top 4 in the championship, and he still thinks he can win the race at this point. So if he takes that chance and it's not the right time to do it, and Yeah, and he's just given Mercedes a 1-2, and he's finishing 5th, 6th. So I don't know.
Not only that, he's nursing a gearbox problem.
Yeah, but at the time we didn't know.
Yeah, I know.
But we didn't know.
But I guess just from my perspective, when he's saying they should have all jumped onto the slicks earlier, I think it was really, unlike any other track, it was really difficult to gauge how bad those conditions really were from the TV, because we weren't getting the spray, because there wasn't any aquaplaning or surface water, but the track wasn't drying. The track was still very, very wet. And there's a lot of curbs at Singapore, and there's a lot of white lines at Singapore. And I think it just wasn't worth it. I thought they switched over at the right time. I thought when they done it was just right. If anyone had gone earlier, and particularly if they had tried to overtake somebody where it was still very, very wet offline, and they would have ended up... And as soon as you were off there, you're in the barrier. You're 3 wheels deep and you're out of the race. So... I feel like you're being unduly critical of the grid and of the strategist on the pit wall. Could someone take a chance? Sure, they could. But is the risk of versus reward really worth it on a day when there's big points up for grabs for the midfield?
Yes.
Like if Kimi had have done it, fair enough. Kimmy's not going to win the championship. He was still in the race later in the race.
Neither's Ricciardo and Perez. So,
but Ricciardo,
go out there and have a crack.
Yeah, so... But, I mean, Force India have never shown themselves to be particularly aggressive from a strategy perspective anyway. They always play the long game. You could have done it with Renault. Maybe Hulkenberg could have done it, but, I mean, he retired from the race anyway, and Renault showed
himself... He was battling Bottas at the time,
Yeah, I mean, they were a step behind on strategy all day anyway. They pitted the lap too late at the start when the safety car came out. So maybe a Haas could have done it, but they needed the points. Williams could have done it, but they desperately need the points to try and stay in contention for 5th. It's from the viewer, for someone to do it, yeah, great. It's terrific to see. So I understand why you're saying it, but I think from a strategic point of view, I can certainly understand why the teams didn't jump at the chance to whack those slicks on. And they still look pretty treacherous when they first put them on, by the way, too. It's not like they went out there and it was immediately, oh, look at that ace. It was there was a couple of moments out there. So yeah, and plus the inters and the wets weren't really wearing out, and when they first put the slicks on, they weren't going any faster. So I feel like they got it just about right from my perspective, playing devil's advocate to your position.
Beat.
All right, we'll end with that. Thanks to Luce, we pushed an extra 10 minutes, so everyone's welcome for the 70 minutes of fun that we had tonight. So I will we'll wind it up here. Greg, your final thoughts as we head to Malaysia for the last time, I might add.
I hadn't considered that. It is a shame, mostly because of the time zone. And it's not a bad circuit either. It does produce some good racing, so that's sad. I guess...
And Ferrari like to win there as well.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're asking for final thoughts on the championship, it's going to come down to some luck now. We're going to have to see some more no engine failures at Malaysia from Lewis Hamilton, if we're lucky. But
hopefully a specific Petronas oil failure, fuel failure would be hilarious.
Right.
But is Malaysia the best race? Wouldn't you want to get those points back at a Mercedes track rather than a track that Ferrari will probably go quite well at, or you don't really care?
Well, is Malaysia a Mercedes track? I don't.
Probably not so much this year. It's a bit of a compromise track. There's long straights, but the twisty bits are important. Luce seems to think it'll suit the Mercedes car.
User entered your channel.
So,
oh dear.
I'll put my final thoughts in now, right?
All right, mate. You can throw it. We'll go to you shortly for your final thoughts, and you'll have to wrap it up inside 30 seconds. All right.
Easy, mate.
All right, Luce, go ahead. Your final thoughts.
Obviously, I reckon it's going to be Mercedes track at Malaysia. Obviously, I reckon the long wheelbase will suit them, and they're going to have a couple tenths on Ferrari.
All right, Matt, your first and final thoughts post Singapore.
Well, Seb really screwed that one up, didn't he?
Oh, good. Finally, someone agrees with me.
They botched that, but he's got time. He's got time, and there's plenty more things that can happen. It's everyone's looking at it like 28 points is massive, but it's not.
No, it's
Not massive. It's not over till Norbert Howe sings. He hasn't started singing yet, so I think Ferrari would be pretty good in Malaysia, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree.
Especially
I
the
agree with
heat,
that.
the tire choices, and the track.
It's
The track will suit them.
It's Mexico that's going to suit that's going to suit Mercedes
Correct.
between here and the end of the year.
Yeah, so-
I think Interlagos will suit Ferrari. I guess I might as well just do my final thoughts on stronger tracks. I think Interlagos will suit Ferrari. Abu Dhabi will suit Mercedes. I think Mexico will suit Mercedes, but I think Malaysia will actually turn out to be a very, very good weekend for Ferrari. Suzuka will suit Ferrari, I think. And Coda, where I'll be, track dropping. Coda is the tough one because Coda will work for both of them, I think. I think actually could be quite the closest race between now and the end of the year.
The first sector is certainly going to, I think Ferrari will be quite good through there, but then after
First
that,
and final will suit them.
Yeah, it's very stop go for most of the laps. So it's very much there's a lot of
It's not just circus characteristics, but it's temperature and tire choice.
Yes, for sure.
Ferrari, anything that's hot, Ferrari is strong.
Yep.
Anything with soft compound picked, Ferrari is strong.
Which is why I think Interlagos and Malaysia will work for them. Abu Dhabi could also work for them because they tend to go very soft there and it's hot. So we'll see. Good finish.
Yeah, exactly. So
Anything you'd like to finish on, Matt, as a final contribution?
I hope Alo signs up this week.
And a single word: has McLaren made the right decision?
In a single word.
Yes.
yeah, that they have.
Okay. All right. Good. That was 3, but we'll take them. Okay. Thanks for everybody who tuned in. Thanks to Senraku who sent us some messages and threw some questions at us midway. Very appreciative. Be sure to watch the Malaysian Grand Prix. It will, as it stands right now, be the last Malaysian Grand Prix that Formula One will have for the time being. So be sure to check it out. The championship is a long way from over. So don't give up on Seb just yet. Let's just hope that he keeps his wheel a little bit straighter next time into turn 1. Once again, thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll catch you in a couple of weeks' time for the post-Malaysia show.